The year is 1645, and in a cave on Mount Iwato, beneath layers of stone and silence, Miyamoto Musashi should have taken his final breath. He should have laid down his brush, closed his eyes, and let the world continue without him. But he doesn't. His heart continues its steady rhythm, his lungs draw in the cool mountain air, and time simply moves forward, carrying him with it. The manuscript of the Book of Five Rings rests beside him, ink still drying on pages that were meant to be his last testament. But now they are only a beginning. He rises, joints stiff, muscles tight, and steps out into a world that does not yet know he has defied its most fundamental law. The sun sets over Kumamoto, painting the sky in shades of amber and rust, and Musashi walks down the mountain path, not toward death, but toward centuries yet unborn. He has lived 59 years as a mortal man, and now, without understanding why or how, he will live beyond the boundaries of human time. The sword at his side, the wooden bokken he carved himself, feels heavier now, or perhaps it is the weight of endless tomorrows pressing against his spirit. In the villages below, farmers tend their fields, unaware that the greatest swordsman Japan has ever known still breathes, still walks, still sees the world through eyes that have witnessed over 60 duels and countless battles. But Musashi is no longer the young Ronin who sought glory and fame. He is something else now, something undefined, suspended between the life he lived and the eternity stretching before him like an uncharted road. The mountains know him, the wind knows him, but the future is a vast and silent opponent he has never faced before. He remembers his first duel at age 13, the trembling in his hands, the taste of fear mixed with exhilaration. That boy seems impossibly distant now, separated not just by decades but by the strange transformation happening within his body, a transformation he cannot name or understand. The Tokugawa shogunate tightens its grip on Japan as the decades pass, and Musashi moves through the changing landscape like a ghost from another age. He does not age. His hair remains black, his face unlined, his hands steady and strong. By 1670, he has become a wanderer once more, traveling from province to province, watching as the war-torn country of his youth transforms into something resembling peace. He sees former battlefields turned into rice paddies, castles that once rang with the clash of steel now standing silent against the sky. The samurai class, to which he belongs, begins its slow transformation from warriors into bureaucrats, their swords becoming symbols rather than tools of survival. Musashi practices each morning in remote places, forests, riverbanks, mountain clearings, maintaining the disciplines that defined his mortal life. The two-sword technique he perfected, Naita Nichiryu, flows through his movements like water, unchanged by time. But the world around him changes constantly, relentlessly. He watches young samurai who have never seen real battle, their kata precise but empty of the desperate urgency that once filled every movement with life or death. In Edo, the great city growing larger each year, Musashi walks streets crowded with merchants and artisans, his presence unremarkable among thousands. No one recognizes him. The legendary duelist is believed to be long dead, his exploits already transforming into myth and exaggeration. He hears stories about himself told in tea-houses, versions of his life twisted and embellished until he barely recognizes the man they describe. Sasaki Kojiro, his greatest rival, the man he killed on Ganryu Island so many decades ago, That duel has already become legend, the details changing with each telling. Musashi listens in silence, neither confirming nor denying, simply absorbing how quickly truth becomes story, how easily history forgets itself. He takes a room in a modest inn and lies awake at night, listening to the sounds of the city, feeling the strange loneliness of being surrounded by people yet utterly isolated by the secret of his condition. He wonders if this is punishment for the men he killed, for the blood on his hands, for the pride that drove him to seek perfection through violence. By 1700, Musashi has lived longer than any mortal could, and he begins to understand the peculiar isolation of immortality. He takes students occasionally, teaching them the sword arts without revealing who he truly is, a wandering master, unnamed, appearing and disappearing like morning mist. He watches these students grow old, watches them marry and have children, watches them die peacefully in their sleep or suddenly in accidents or slowly through illness. Each death reminds him of what he has lost, the natural progression toward an ending, the completion of a human story. His own story has no ending, and this begins to feel less like a gift and more like a sentence he cannot escape. The Genroku era brings cultural flourishing to Japan. Poetry, theater, art, pleasure districts thriving in cities like Edo and Osaka. Musashi observes this transformation with mixed feelings. The martial world he knew is fading, becoming ceremonial, decorative. The kabuki theaters perform plays about samurai honor and dramatic duels, but the actors have never held a real sword in combat, never felt the sickening impact of steel cutting flesh. He sits in the back of these theaters sometimes, watching idealized versions of the life he actually lived, and feels the strange disconnect between memory and performance. His own past becomes entertainment, simplified and dramatized for audiences seeking escape from their peaceful, ordered lives. In Kyoto, the old capital, he visits temples where he once meditated before important duels, and finds them changed, renovated, surrounded by new buildings and expanded gardens. The priests are different, younger, speaking of traditions they inherited but never witnessed. Musashi kneels in prayer before Buddha, not asking for anything, simply existing in the silence, feeling the weight of decades accumulating like sediment in a deep river. He begins to keep journals, writing in coded language about his experiences, documenting the slow transformation of Japan and his own internal journey through time. These journals become his companions, the only witnesses to his true identity, the only place where he can be honest about what he is and what he has become. The 18th century unfolds slowly, and Musashi moves through it like a man walking through water, every step requiring effort, every year adding to the accumulated strangeness of his condition. He is over 150 years old now, though his body remains that of a man in his prime. He has learned to fabricate identities, to claim different names and backgrounds, to move from region to region before his unchanging appearance raises too many questions. The Sakoku policy keeps Japan isolated from the outside world, and within this closed system, Musashi exists in his own kind of isolation, unable to form lasting connections with people who will inevitably age and die while he remains constant. He reads constantly, absorbing the philosophical and artistic developments of each era, watching as Neo-Confucianism shapes the intellectual landscape of Japan. The rigid social hierarchy of the Tokugawa period feels suffocating to him, a man who once lived by his sword alone, beholden to no lord, answerable only to his own code. Now samurai are expected to be literate bureaucrats, skilled in administration and protocol, their martial training more ceremonial than practical. Musashi could challenge this system, could use his skills to disrupt the careful order of things, but he doesn't. He has lived long enough to understand that individual resistance is meaningless against the weight of historical change. Instead, he watches, documents mentally, becomes a silent witness to transformation. In 1750, he encounters a young painter in Nagasaki, one of the few ports open to limited foreign trade, and sees Dutch ships in the harbor, massive vessels from a world beyond Japan's shores. The sight stirs something in him, a curiosity about what lies beyond the ocean, but he knows he cannot leave. His immortality is bound somehow to this land, to these islands, to the soil that has soaked up so much blood and history. He spends months in Nagasaki, studying the Dutch traders from a distance, observing their strange clothing and customs, hearing fragments of their incomprehensible language, and understanding for the first time that Japan is just one small part of a much larger world, a world that continues evolving and changing beyond the closed borders of the archipelago. This realization both excites and disturbs him, expanding his sense of what is possible while also emphasizing his confinement to this single nation, this single culture, these islands from which he can never escape. The late 18th century brings famines and unrest, peasant uprisings that challenge the stability of the Tokugawa order, and Musashi witnesses suffering on a scale that reminds him of the Sengo period of his youth. He helps where he can, teaching farming techniques he has learned over decades, sharing rice from his own supplies, defending villages from bandits with a wooden sword that strikes like steel. But he is careful, always careful, never revealing too much, never staying too long. The authorities grow increasingly paranoid about ronin and masterless samurai, seeing potential rebellion in every wandering swordsman. Musashi moves through this landscape of suspicion and hunger, his own existence a secret more profound than any political intrigue. He thinks often about the Book of Five Rings, the manuscript he completed in that cave so long ago, wondering if anyone still reads it, if his words have survived the centuries. He does not know that his writings have been copied and distributed, that students of the sword art study his principles, that his name, though attached to a man supposedly long dead, still carries weight in certain circles. By 1800, Musashi is over 200 years old, and the accumulation of memories has become its own kind of burden. He remembers faces of people who died a century ago more clearly than events that happened last week. He remembers the smell of battlefields, the sound of arrows cutting through air, the weight of armor he no longer wears. These memories exist in layers, overlapping and intersecting, creating a mental landscape more complex and detailed than the physical world around him. Sometimes he paints landscapes, birds, bamboo, using techniques he learned from masters who are now forgotten by everyone but him. His paintings are good, technically proficient, but they lack something, perhaps the urgency that comes from knowing your time is limited, that each brushstroke is one among a finite number you will make before death claims your hand. He sells these paintings occasionally for modest sums, just enough to sustain his simple lifestyle, never seeking fame or recognition, content to remain anonymous in a world that has forgotten his face but remembers his name as legend. In moments of deep meditation, he sometimes touches what feels like the edge of an answer to why he persists, why death has not claimed him. But the answer always slips away before he can grasp it fully, leaving only a sense of purpose not yet fulfilled, a task not yet completed, though he cannot name what that task might be. The 19th century arrives with tremors of change that even Musashi, with all his accumulated experience, does not fully anticipate. The arrival of Commodore Perry's black ships in 1853 shatters Japan's isolation, forcing the country to confront a world that has continued evolving while Japan remained frozen in its Edo period structures. Musashi watches from the shores near Uraga as massive steamships belch smoke into the sky, their iron hulls unlike anything Japanese shipbuilders have created, their cannons representing military technology far beyond the swords and muskets of the Tokugawa forces. For the first time in centuries, Musashi feels something like the excitement he knew as a young duelist, the awareness that the world contains forces he has not mastered, challenges he has not faced. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 transforms Japan more rapidly and radically than any change Musashi has witnessed in his 2 centuries of immortal life. The samurai class is abolished, the wearing of swords banned, the entire feudal system dismantled in favor of rapid modernization and westernization. Musashi watches his own identity, the warrior, the duelist, the master of the sword, become officially obsolete, a relic of a discarded past. Young men in Western suits and haircuts walk the streets of Tokyo, speaking of railroads and factories and constitutional government, dismissing the samurai era as backward and inefficient. Musashi could resent this, could cling to the values of his youth, but he has lived too long to be rigid. He adapts, as he has always adapted. He learns new languages, English, French, German, absorbing them with the discipline he once applied to sword techniques. He studies the technologies reshaping Japan, steam engines, telegraphs, photography, understanding them not as magical foreign imports but as logical developments of human ingenuity. He takes work as a translator and language instructor, his quick mastery of foreign tongues attributed to natural talent rather than the accumulated learning capacity of an immortal mind. He moves to Tokyo, the new capital, and watches the city transform from Edo's wooden structures into a metropolis of brick and stone and modern architecture. The transformation is so rapid, so total, that sometimes he walks streets he knew a decade earlier and cannot recognize them, every landmark replaced, every familiar building demolished and rebuilt in Western style. This physical erasure of the past mirrors the cultural erasure happening across Japan, the deliberate rejection of tradition in favor of modernity, the rush to catch up with the West at any cost. Musashi understands the strategic necessity of this transformation, recognizes that Japan must modernize or risk colonization, but he also grieves for what is lost, for the beauty and discipline and aesthetic refinement of the world that shaped him. By the turn of the 20th century, Musashi has lived through transformations that would have been unimaginable to the young ronin who once challenged opponents to duels on isolated beaches and mountain paths. He walks the streets of Tokyo, a city of millions, where electric lights banish the darkness and tramcars run on iron rails and newspapers report events from around the globe within days of their occurrence. He has learned to navigate this modern world, creating documentary evidence of identities that allow him to exist within bureaucratic systems, though he changes these identities every few decades, moving from city to city, always careful to avoid sustained scrutiny. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 stirs something old and familiar in his chest. The sound of military mobilization, the sight of young men preparing for battle, the smell of gunpowder and steel. He does not fight. His skills with swords are meaningless in an age of rifles and artillery and modern tactics. But he watches, and in watching recognizes the same patterns he saw in the battles of his youth, the same mix of courage and fear and chaos that defines all warfare regardless of technology. The soldiers are different, their weapons are different, their strategies are different, but the fundamental human experience of combat remains constant across centuries. He sees wounded men in hospitals, their injuries inflicted by bullets and shrapnel rather than arrows and blades, but their pain and trauma are identical to what he witnessed in the aftermath of Sekigahara and countless other battles of his mortal youth. The First World War, though Japan's involvement is limited, signals to Musashi that warfare itself has evolved into something even more destructive than he imagined possible. He reads accounts of trench warfare, machine guns, poison gas, millions of deaths across Europe, and understands that the intimate violence of swordplay has been replaced by industrial-scale killing where individual skill means nothing against the machinery of modern armies. This realization troubles him deeply. The martial way he devoted his life to perfecting has become irrelevant, not just in Japan but globally, replaced by technologies that make individual prowess meaningless. He wonders if this is why he persists, to witness the complete transformation of warfare, to see the logical endpoint of human violence, to understand what his life's work ultimately meant in the larger arc of history. The 1920s bring jazz music and Western fashions and democratic ideals to Japan, and Musashi finds himself adapting once again, wearing modern clothes, listening to radio broadcasts, watching silent films that flicker in darkened theaters. He is nearly 300 years old, and the accumulated weight of centuries sits on him like armor he can never remove, protection that has become burden. The 1920s and 1930s bring both modernization and growing militarism to Japan, and Musashi, now approaching 300 years of life, watches his homeland slide toward another great conflict. He has seen wars before, participated in them, killed men in single combat and in the chaos of battlefield melees, but the scale of what is coming exceeds anything in his experience. He tries to maintain his disciplines, meditation, practice with wooden swords in private spaces, calligraphy, painting, but these feel increasingly like echoes of a world that no longer exists. The Japan of his youth was brutal and chaotic, but it was also governed by codes he understood, hierarchies that made sense within their own logic. Modern Japan, lurching between democracy and fascism, between tradition and westernization, between peaceful development and imperial expansion, confuses him in ways that 2 centuries of experience have not prepared him for. When the Second World War begins, Musashi is living in a small town in rural Kumamoto, the same region where he supposedly died 300 years earlier. He maintains a low profile, working as a calligraphy teacher, his unchanging appearance explained by claims of good genetics and healthy living. He watches young men march off to war in China, then across the Pacific, and knows from the patterns of history that this will end badly. Empires overextend themselves. Military adventures collapse under their own weight. Hubris invites catastrophe. The firebombing of Tokyo in 1945, the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, These events shatter even Musashi's accumulated equanimity. He has seen cities burn before, has walked through the aftermath of sieges and battles where thousands died, but the instantaneous annihilation of entire urban populations by single weapons represents a threshold he never imagined humanity would cross. In the ruins of the war, Musashi helps where he can, clearing rubble, distributing food, teaching children whose fathers will never return from distant battlefields. But he feels the terrible weight of all his years, all his memories, pressing down on him like stones piled on a buried body. He travels to Hiroshima months after the bombing, walks through the flattened wasteland where a city once stood, and feels something breaking inside him, a barrier that had protected him from fully feeling the accumulated grief of 3 centuries. He weeps for the first time in decades, not just for the victims of the atomic bomb, but for everyone he has watched die across 300 years, for all the students and friends and brief companions who aged and passed while he remained, for the fundamental loneliness of his impossible existence. This grief is cleansing in its way, washing away some of the detachment that had calcified around his heart, reconnecting him to his own humanity even as the evidence of humanity's capacity for destruction surrounds him in every direction. The post-war period brings yet another transformation, Japan rising from devastation to become an economic powerhouse, rebuilding cities and industries with astonishing speed, adopting democracy and pacifism while maintaining threads of cultural continuity that connect the modern nation to its feudal past. Musashi lives through this renaissance as he has lived through every other era, watching, learning, adapting, but always apart, always separate from the flow of normal human life. By the 1960s and 1970s, he exists in a world that would be completely incomprehensible to the young swordsman who once carved wooden bokken in mountain forests. Television brings images from around the world into living rooms. Computers begin their slow infiltration into business and research. Japan's bullet trains run at speeds that reduce travel time between cities to mere hours. Musashi rides these trains sometimes, watching the landscape blur past, thinking about the weeks it once took to walk from Kyoto to Edo, the dangers of bandit-infested roads and treacherous mountain passes. Now safety is assumed, speed is normal, comfort is expected. He teaches occasionally, not swordsmanship, though he could, but rather calligraphy and meditation, presenting himself as a practitioner of traditional arts, his expertise explained by decades of dedicated study rather than centuries of accumulated practice. His students are earnest, respectful, but they live in a world so distant from his origins that he sometimes feels like an alien observer, a being from another planet studying human culture with clinical detachment. The economic bubble of the 1980s, the lost decades that follow, the technological explosion of the 1990s and 2000s. Musashi witnesses all of it with the patience of someone who has learned that all rises eventually fall, all falls eventually rise, that human civilization moves in vast cycles that individual lives cannot perceive but immortal observation makes clear. He watches the rise of personal computers, the birth of the internet, the transformation of communication and information access that these technologies enable, and recognizes in them the same pattern he saw in the introduction of firearms to Japan centuries ago, new technologies that fundamentally alter how humans interact with each other and with the world, rendering previous skills obsolete while creating demands for new forms of expertise. He learns to use these technologies with the same methodical discipline he applied to mastering the sword, understanding that adaptation is survival, that resistance to change is a form of death even for someone who cannot physically die. By the early 2000s, Musashi maintains multiple online identities, participates in forums and discussions, shares insights anonymously, finding in the internet's anonymity a freedom he rarely experiences in physical space, the ability to communicate without the complications of his unchanging appearance, to share knowledge without revealing its impossible source. The 21st century arrives, and with it comes a level of technological integration that begins to complicate even Musashi's carefully maintained anonymity. Facial recognition software, digital databases, surveillance cameras everywhere. The modern world tracks and records in ways that make long-term identity maintenance increasingly difficult. He must be more careful now, more strategic about his movements and interactions, avoiding situations where his unchanging appearance might be documented and compared across decades. He lives in the mountains again, returning to something like the solitude of his youth, though these mountains have hiking trails and cellular towers and tourists taking photographs with devices that would have seemed like sorcery to the people of feudal Japan. He has internet access in his small cabin, and through it, he explores the accumulated knowledge of human civilization, reading research papers on biology that still cannot explain his condition, watching videos of sword demonstrations by practitioners who have studied his techniques through written records and oral traditions, seeing his own name and legacy discussed and debated by people who have no idea he still exists. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 brings a strange resonance with plagues he witnessed in the 17th and 18th centuries. The same fear, the same isolation, the same loss of life on massive scales, though modern medicine and public health measures eventually bring it under some measure of control. Musashi weathers the pandemic as he has weathered everything else, with patience, discipline, and the deep solitude that has become his constant companion. He is over 400 years old now, and the question that haunted him in his first centuries of immortality has evolved into something else. Not why am I still alive, but rather what am I meant to do with this endless life? He has no answer, has never found an answer, has learned to exist without needing one. During the lockdowns, he spends weeks in complete isolation, speaking to no one, practicing his sword forms in the small clearing behind his cabin, meditating for hours each day, writing in his journals, hundreds of volumes now, stored in waterproof containers, documenting 4 centuries of Japanese history from the perspective of a single impossible witness. He sometimes imagines these journals being discovered after his death, if death ever comes, becoming primary sources for historians trying to understand the lived experience of feudal Japan and everything that followed. But he also knows he can never allow them to be found during his lifetime. They contain too much truth, too many details that would expose his impossible existence, invite unwanted attention and scrutiny he has spent centuries avoiding. In the 2020s, Musashi maintains a presence online under various pseudonyms, participating in forums dedicated to martial arts philosophy, contributing insights that draw from centuries of experience but are presented as the thoughts of a particularly well-read enthusiast. He finds a strange satisfaction in this, the ability to share fragments of his accumulated wisdom without revealing their true source, to influence and educate without the burden of authority or recognition. Young martial artists around the world read his comments and posts, unaware they are receiving instruction from the legendary Miyamoto Musashi himself, the man whose Book of Five Rings remains a bestseller nearly 4 centuries after he wrote it. He watches videos of modern sword practitioners demonstrating techniques he invented, sees them make small mistakes in form that he could correct but doesn't, allowing the tradition to evolve naturally, as all traditions must. Sometimes he travels, though always carefully, always with forged documents and constructed backgrounds that can withstand casual scrutiny. He visits Ganryu Island, the site of his most famous duel, now a minor tourist destination with a monument commemorating the battle between Musashi and Kojiro. He stands before this monument, looking at the stylized sculpture representing a moment from his own past, and feels the disorienting disconnect between lived experience and historical commemoration. The real duel was messier than the monument suggests, more desperate, more ugly, the killing blow delivered with a crude wooden sword against an opponent who was skilled but ultimately outmaneuvered by Musashi's psychological tactics and strategic timing. The monument makes it look noble, elegant, transforming a lethal confrontation into art. Musashi understands this is necessary. History must simplify to be transmitted, must become story to survive. But understanding doesn't make it less strange to see your own life converted into symbols and myths. He leaves an offering at the monument, a small gesture that no one notices, a private acknowledgement of Kojiro's skill and the weight of having taken his life. He has thought about that duel countless times over the centuries, analyzing every decision, every movement, questioning whether it was necessary, whether his younger self's pursuit of reputation justified the ending of another human life. The answer shifts depending on when he asks the question. Sometimes he believes it was justified within the context of that era and that culture. Sometimes he sees it as senseless violence born from ego and ambition. Both answers feel true, and the tension between them has never resolved, perhaps never will resolve, remaining instead as a permanent question mark hovering over his entire existence. He thinks often about death now, not with fear or longing but with curiosity, wondering if it will ever come, if his immortality has a limit he hasn't yet reached, if some unknown condition might eventually be satisfied allowing him to finally rest. He has lived longer than any human should, witnessed more history than any mind was meant to contain, and while he has adapted to each era, while he has found ways to continue existing with purpose and discipline, there is a weariness in him that no amount of sleep or meditation can touch. It is the weariness of someone who has outlived not just friends and family but entire civilizations, entire ways of being human. The samurai world into which he was born is as distant now as ancient Rome or Egypt, preserved only in museums and historical recreations and martial arts dojos where students practice forms without fully understanding their original context. Musashi is the last living connection to that world, the only person who actually existed as a warrior in feudal Japan and continues to exist in the age of smartphones and space stations and artificial intelligence. This gives him a unique perspective, but it is also a burden. He is a bridge between eras that perhaps should not be bridged, a continuity that nature never intended. In his mountain cabin, he continues to paint and practice calligraphy, his brushstrokes as precise and controlled as they were centuries ago. He has painted thousands of works over his long life, most of them lost or destroyed, some likely hanging in museums attributed to various unknown artists from different periods. He paints the same subjects he always has: bamboo, birds, landscapes, simple compositions that capture moments of natural beauty with minimal strokes. This discipline centers him, reminds him of principles that transcend time: simplicity, directness, economy of motion, the search for essential truth beneath superficial complexity. One evening, as he completes a painting of Mount Fuji at sunset, he realizes that he has painted this subject hundreds of times over the centuries, each version slightly different, capturing the mountain in different seasons and weather conditions and times of day, and that taken together, these paintings constitute a kind of serial meditation on permanence and change, the mountain enduring while everything around it transforms, just as he endures while Japan transforms around him. The parallel is almost too obvious, but it brings him a moment of peace. Perhaps his existence serves no grand purpose. Perhaps he is simply here to witness and document, to be present as the centuries unfold, and perhaps that is enough. Climate change begins to alter the landscape in ways that even Musashi, with all his experience of natural variation, recognizes as unprecedented. The seasons shift, typhoons intensify, temperatures rise, and he sees in these changes echoes of how human civilization has grown beyond the constraints that once limited its impact on the world. Just as warfare evolved from swords to nuclear weapons, just as cities grew from thousands to millions, humanity's footprint on the earth itself has expanded to global scale. He wonders sometimes if his own impossible longevity is somehow connected to these larger patterns, perhaps the same forces that have allowed human civilization to persist and expand have also, through some mechanism he doesn't understand, allowed him to persist beyond natural limits. Or perhaps there is no connection. Perhaps his immortality is purely random, a biological anomaly without meaning or purpose. He has stopped searching for explanations, accepting that some questions cannot be answered even with 400 years to contemplate them. In 2025, Musashi is living in a small apartment in Kyoto, a city he has watched transform countless times over the centuries. He works remotely as a translator, his fluency in multiple languages and deep understanding of Japanese history making him valuable to academic institutions and publishing houses. His colleagues know him only through email and video calls, his unchanging appearance explained by the flattering angles and soft focus of webcam technology. He maintains minimal social contact, preferring the solitude that has become his natural state. Though he is not completely isolated, he corresponds with martial artists, philosophers, artists, people who share his interests if not his impossible history. These connections are superficial but meaningful, brief touches of human contact that remind him he still exists within the human world even if he can never fully belong to it. He takes long walks through Kyoto in the early mornings, before tourists fill the streets, before the city fully wakes. He walks paths he has walked for centuries, past temples that were old when he was young and are ancient now, through gardens that have been cultivated and tended by generations of gardeners who lived and died while he remained unchanged. These walks ground him, connect him to the physical reality of place even as time flows past like an endless river. He stops sometimes at a particular temple garden, sits on the same bench he has sat on for decades, though the bench itself has been replaced many times, and watches the light change as the sun rises, the shadows shifting across carefully raked gravel and precisely placed stones. This simple observation, repeated thousands of times, never loses its power to quiet his mind and bring him into the present moment, reminding him that regardless of how many years he has lived, he only ever exists in this single moment of now. The development of advanced AI systems in the mid-2020s fascinates Musashi in ways few other technologies have. He sees in these systems a kind of mirror of his own condition, non-human intelligence, entities that process information and generate responses based on patterns learned from vast datasets, existing without the biological constraints that limit mortal humans. He wonders if these AI entities will eventually achieve something like consciousness, and if so, whether their experience of existence will resemble his own, a kind of detached observation, participation without full integration, understanding without truly belonging. He experiments with these systems, asking them questions about sword technique and philosophy, testing the boundaries of their knowledge against his own lived experience. The results are mixed. The AI systems know facts and can generate plausible-sounding advice, but they lack the embodied understanding that comes from actually gripping a sword, actually facing an opponent, actually feeling the split-second timing that determines life and death in combat. This limitation is obvious to Musashi, and it reinforces his understanding that some forms of knowledge cannot be transmitted through language alone, cannot be reduced to data or algorithms, but require direct physical experience to truly comprehend. Still, he finds value in these interactions, using AI as a kind of conversational partner, someone or something with whom he can discuss ideas without the complications of human relationship, without the inevitable grief that comes from watching people age and die while he remains unchanged. The AI doesn't age, doesn't die, doesn't judge or pity him. It simply responds, processes, generates text based on patterns it has learned, and in this mechanical consistency, Musashi finds a strange comfort. He writes extensively in his journals about these AI systems, documenting his observations and reflections, wondering if future historians will find these entries interesting or merely quaint, the thoughts of an impossible being from the feudal era trying to understand the digital entities of the future. He also uses AI to help maintain his various identities, generating plausible background information and documentation that allows him to continue existing within modern bureaucratic systems without raising suspicions. The irony is not lost on him. Using artificial intelligence to sustain his impossible biological immortality, enlisting machines to help him hide in plain sight among normal humans who would never believe his true story even if he told them directly. By 2026, Musashi has been alive for 440 years, and the world continues its relentless transformation around him. Japan faces demographic challenges, an aging population, declining birth rates, questions about immigration and cultural identity, and Musashi observes these debates with the perspective of someone who has seen the country transform countless times before. Japan is not eternal, no nation is. All civilizations rise and fall and transform into something new. And while this realization might be troubling to someone with a normal lifespan, to Musashi it is simply the way things are, the natural rhythm of historical time. He thinks sometimes about what Japan might become in another century, another 3 centuries, another 1,000 years, and wonders if he will still be here to witness it, still walking these islands, still maintaining his silent observation of human change and continuity. The thought is both fascinating and exhausting, the possibility of endless tomorrows stretching out forever, each day adding another memory to the vast accumulation already weighing on his consciousness. He has developed techniques for managing this mental burden, meditation practices that allow him to store memories in layers, accessing them when needed but not carrying them all in active awareness constantly. He can recall his youth if he chooses, can remember specific duels and conversations and moments with perfect clarity, but most of the time these memories rest dormant, present but not pressing, like books on shelves he can read when desired but doesn't need to carry everywhere. This mental discipline has allowed him to function across centuries without losing coherence, without fragmenting under the weight of accumulated experience. And it is perhaps his greatest achievement, greater than any duel he won, greater than any student he taught, the simple fact of maintaining identity and sanity across an impossible span of time. He sometimes meets with a therapist, using a false identity and carefully edited life story, finding value in having someone to talk to about the existential challenges of existence even if he cannot reveal their true depth and scope. The therapist thinks he is a lonely older man struggling with isolation and the sense that the world has changed too much, which is true enough as far as it goes, and offers strategies for maintaining connection and finding meaning that Musashi adapts to his actual situation. These sessions help, providing a kind of mirror even if the mirror cannot reflect his full reality, reminding him that the fundamental human struggles with loneliness and purpose and mortality transcend individual circumstances, connecting him to the broader human experience even in his isolation. He occasionally encounters people who remind him of figures from his past, a young swordsman with the same intense focus he saw in Kojiro, a poet with the philosophical depth of the Zen masters he studied with in his youth, a painter whose brushwork echoes techniques he learned 3 centuries ago. These encounters are bittersweet, moments of connection tinged with the knowledge that these people will age and die while he continues, that any relationship he forms is inherently temporary from his perspective, a brief intersection of trajectories that quickly diverge. He has learned to appreciate these moments without clinging to them, to value the experience of connection without expecting it to last, and this detachment is both a survival strategy and a loss. He has protected himself from the pain of endless grief by accepting impermanence so completely that nothing truly touches him anymore. Sometimes he wonders if this is a form of death in itself, not the cessation of biological function, but the gradual erosion of emotional capacity, the slow transformation from a feeling human being into something more like a witness, an observer, a recording device capturing events without truly participating in them. But then he paints, or practices sword forms, or writes in his journals, and feels something that might be called joy or satisfaction or purpose, and knows that some essential part of him remains vital, remains engaged, remains fundamentally human despite the centuries that separate him from the life he was born into. The future extends before him like a road disappearing into mist. He cannot see what lies ahead, cannot know if his immortality will continue or suddenly end, cannot predict what transformations humanity will undergo in the coming decades and centuries. All he can do is continue, one day at a time, one breath at a time, one brushstroke at a time, maintaining the disciplines that have sustained him through 4 centuries and will hopefully sustain him through whatever comes next. He has learned that the secret to surviving immortality is to approach each day as if it were both his first and his last, bringing the fresh curiosity of a beginner to every experience while also practicing the deliberate mindfulness of someone who knows that this moment, right now, is all that truly exists. This paradoxical approach allows him to engage with life without being overwhelmed by its endlessness, to find meaning in the immediate without losing sight of the vast patterns that only centuries of observation can reveal. In quiet moments, Musashi returns to the principles he articulated in the Book of Five Rings, testing them against centuries of subsequent experience, finding them still valid, still useful, still true in ways that transcend their original martial context. The emphasis on direct perception, on cutting through confusion to essential truth, on maintaining calm awareness in chaos, these principles have served him not just in swordsmanship, but in navigating the endless transformations of history. The way of strategy, as he conceived it, is ultimately about understanding patterns, recognizing opportunities, adapting to circumstances without losing sight of fundamental objectives, and these skills are as valuable in the 21st century as they were in feudal Japan. He teaches these principles when he can, disguising them in modern language, presenting them as insights derived from study rather than personal experience, sharing fragments of his accumulated wisdom with people who can benefit from them without needing to know their true source. A young entrepreneur struggling with business challenges receives advice about strategic timing and psychological positioning that comes directly from Musashi's dueling experience. A therapist working with trauma survivors learns about maintaining centered awareness in the midst of emotional chaos, principles Musashi developed through countless battles and meditative practices. These teachings ripple outward in small ways, influencing people who will never know they have received instruction from a 400-year-old immortal samurai, and this hidden influence satisfies something in Musashi, the ability to remain useful, to continue contributing to human flourishing, to justify his continued existence through positive impact even if that impact cannot be attributed or acknowledged. He sometimes imagines a network of influence spreading across the world, his ideas transmitted through students who teach their own students, creating chains of wisdom that extend far beyond any single life or era. And in this vision he finds a kind of immortality even more profound than his biological persistence, the immortality of ideas, of principles that remain valuable across centuries because they touch something fundamental about human experience and the nature of reality itself. This conceptual immortality existed even when he thought he was mortal, his writings ensuring his influence would survive his death. But now he has both, the endless life of his physical body and the endless propagation of his philosophical insights, two forms of persistence that interact in strange and unpredictable ways. The technology of the late 2020s continues to accelerate, virtual reality becoming increasingly sophisticated, artificial intelligence growing more capable, human augmentation through genetic engineering and cybernetic enhancement moving from science fiction toward reality. Musashi observes these developments with interest, but also with questions about what they mean for human identity and experience. If people can upload their consciousness into digital systems, achieving a kind of technological immortality, will they face the same challenges he has faced, the burden of endless memory, the isolation of outliving everyone they know, the difficulty of maintaining purpose across unlimited time? Or will their digital existence be fundamentally different, free from the embodied constraints that still bind him to physical reality despite his impossible longevity? He doesn't know, cannot know, can only watch and wonder as humanity reshapes itself in ways previous generations never imagined possible. Sometimes he considers revealing himself, documenting his existence for scientific study, allowing researchers to examine whatever biological mechanisms have allowed him to persist across centuries. This might advance medical knowledge, might help develop treatments for aging and disease, might benefit humanity in measurable ways. But he always decides against it. The attention would be overwhelming, the loss of privacy complete, his entire existence reduced to a medical curiosity and research subject. He values his solitude too much, values the ability to move through the world unnoticed, to maintain control over his own narrative even if that narrative is shared with almost no one. Perhaps this is selfish. Perhaps he owes humanity whatever insights his condition might provide. But he has lived long enough to understand that he doesn't owe anyone anything, that his existence is his own to manage as he sees fit, that survival across 4 centuries has earned him the right to determine his own path. He makes peace with this decision by continuing to share his wisdom in indirect ways, through online discussions and occasional teaching and the perpetual influence of his written work, contributing to human welfare without sacrificing the anonymity that makes his continued existence bearable. In the spring of 2027, he receives a message from a young woman in Osaka who has been studying Naitanichi Ryu, the two-sword technique he developed 400 years ago, and who wants to discuss certain aspects of timing and distance that she finds confusing in the traditional texts. They correspond for weeks, Musashi carefully guiding her understanding without revealing that he is the actual founder of the school. And in these exchanges he feels something he hasn't felt in decades, the satisfaction of true transmission, of passing on knowledge to someone who genuinely understands and values it, who approaches the martial arts with the seriousness and dedication they deserve. As 2027 progresses toward 2028, Musashi finds himself thinking more about the future than the past, a shift that surprises him given how much history he carries within his memory. Perhaps it is because the future has become more unpredictable than ever before. The combination of climate change, technological acceleration, geopolitical instability, and demographic shifts creating a situation with more uncertainty than any period he can remember. The feudal era was violent but comprehensible. The Tokugawa period was rigid but stable. The Meiji transformation was dramatic but purposeful. Even the chaos of the 20th century followed patterns he could recognize from previous upheavals. But now, in the late 2020s, the pace of change has outstripped the human capacity to fully comprehend or control it, and Musashi senses that humanity is entering uncharted territory, facing challenges that require new ways of thinking, new forms of adaptation, new kinds of wisdom. He wonders if his centuries of experience have prepared him to navigate what comes next, or if the future will be so radically different that even his accumulated knowledge will become irrelevant. He continues his practices, continues his disciplines, continues the daily routines that have sustained him through 445 years, meditation at dawn, sword practice in hidden spaces, calligraphy in the evening, reading and writing late into the night. These activities ground him, provide structure and meaning, connect him to the principles he discovered as a young man and have refined across centuries. The specific forms may change. He practices with wooden swords now rather than steel. He writes on computer keyboards rather than with brush and ink. He meditates in modern apartments rather than mountain caves. But the essential practices remain constant, and through this constancy, he maintains his sense of self across the endless flow of time. One morning, practicing in a forest clearing before dawn, he experiences a moment of perfect clarity, the sword moving through forms that have become so deeply ingrained they require no conscious thought, his body executing techniques with precision developed across 4 centuries of daily practice. And in this moment he understands that this is why he persists, not for any grand purpose or cosmic design, but simply because he has maintained these disciplines, because he has continued the practices that sustain not just his body but his spirit, because he has refused to surrender to the despair or ennui that could easily overwhelm someone who has lived as long as he has. The disciplines themselves are the answer, the practice is the purpose, the continuation is its own justification. And so Musashi continues, walking through yet another day in a life that has spanned more days than he can count, breathing air in lungs that have drawn countless breaths across 4.5 centuries, seeing the world through eyes that have witnessed the rise and fall of eras and empires and entire ways of being human. He does not know why he persists, does not understand the mechanism of his immortality, cannot predict if or when it will end. He only knows that he continues, that each morning he wakes and each evening he sleeps and each day he exists in the space between, making his small contributions, maintaining his disciplines, observing the endless transformation of the world around him. Japan changes, humanity changes, technology changes, but certain things remain constant: the need for discipline, the value of direct perception, the importance of understanding timing and distance and psychology in all forms of conflict and cooperation. These principles sustained him as a duelist, sustained him through centuries of wandering, sustain him now in the digital age, and will likely sustain him through whatever comes next. The future stretches ahead, unknowable and vast, and Musashi walks toward it as he has always walked toward the unknown, with calm awareness, with readiness for whatever may come, with the acceptance that some questions have no answers and some roads have no end. He is Miyamoto Musashi, the greatest swordsman Japan ever produced, and he is still here, still alive, still walking the path, 445 years after the day he should have died in a cave on Mount Iwato. The world continues, time continues, and somewhere in the mountains of Japan, in a small cabin overlooking valleys he has watched change across centuries, an immortal samurai sits in meditation, breathing slowly, existing in the eternal present moment that is all any being, mortal or immortal, ever truly possesses. The sun sets, the stars appear, the night deepens, and tomorrow, as it always does, the sun will rise again, and Musashi will rise with it, continuing his impossible journey through time, forward into years and decades and perhaps centuries yet unborn, a silent witness to the endless flow of history, a bridge between the feudal past and whatever future humanity creates for itself. He does not seek meaning or purpose anymore. He simply continues, and in continuing, becomes his own answer to the question of why. Outside his window, cherry blossoms are beginning to bloom, the same delicate flowers that bloomed in his youth, that have bloomed every spring for 445 years while he watched, that will bloom next spring and the spring after that, marking time's passage with their brief beauty and inevitable fall. He watches them now, as he has watched them countless times before, finding in their transient perfection a reminder of what he has lost and what he has gained, the natural rhythm of birth and death denied to him, but also the accumulated wisdom that comes from witnessing this cycle repeat endlessly, from understanding impermanence so deeply that he can appreciate each moment's unique beauty even knowing it will pass. The flowers bloom, and Musashi watches, and time flows forward like a river that never reaches the sea, and he continues, because that is what he does, what he has always done, what perhaps he will always do, continue, persist, remain, a single point of continuity in a world of constant change, a witness to history's endless unfolding, a practitioner of disciplines that transcend any single era or culture, a human being who has somehow outlived the human lifespan, yet remains fundamentally human in his search for meaning, purpose, and understanding. The path continues, and he walks it, one step after another, into the vast unknown of tomorrow.